Alright, this is the final version of my RF Jugg, something that I definitely call min-maxed, which I used to take down multiple Uber bosses. Though, in that regard, I would avoid Uber Maven, because anti-healing beams suck, and unless you're going to dodge them all, you'll probably end up burning to death. No, this build isn't going to be the best for farming Ubers. Its kill speed isn't the 0 seconds of insta-kill builds like Explodey Totem, but I have killed several successfully while doing a whole host of other content. And to be clear, this isn't a build guide, it's just a showcase. If you want to know more about the mechanics of how Righteous Fire works, how I made a lot of my gear, or more about the build in general, check out my previous RF videos that will be up in the card and down in the description. I'm gonna kind of assume that you saw those, or at least are willing to go back and reference them as I go forward and focus on the changes to my gear along with some upgrades. So with that, let's get into it, starting with the weapon. There's several ways to make this. For example, I started from a fractured +1 all spell skills and rolled it with scorched fossils. This is because I wanted a weapon the fastest, and selling my old one would pay for whatever it cost me. In fact, I think I ended up going positive by a couple divines. But alternatively, you could start from a fractured fire dot multi-weapon, which last I checked was the cheapest option, or from a fractured dot multi-weapon, which does ultimately give the best outcome but has the most annoying and lengthy crafting process. In this case, I also wanted an open suffix for trigger, so I wouldn't need to manually cast my curses. It's probably ideal to cast them manually, but I just didn't want to be bothered and had plenty of DPS either way. Next up, my helmet is exactly the same, though it does have a shiny new fire trap enchant that adds quite a bit of damage. My boots, one ring, and belt are also all the same, so no more info on that, check out my previous video. For my chest, because I've been bossing more, I've been using Fourth Vow. This means I swapped to Sanctum of Thought for crit mitigation, and swapped to Fizz Taken as Chaos. Brash Dome is still the most well-rounded option in my opinion, and defends best against Fizz. So if you plan to fight enemies that hit really hard and have almost pure physical damage, that is still a great choice. But if you're fighting enemies like Uber bosses with high elemental damage and elemental penetration, then I suggest a Fourth Vow corrupted with reduced extra damage from crit strikes. If you want to know more about chests and comparing a bunch of different ones, I made a full video on that, which I'll also link. And that goes into the comparison in a lot more detail. Now, another thing that I ran into as I was min-maxing is socket starvation. It's been a serious issue for this build, and honestly a lot of my builds. So when I finally got around to swapping out my Death Rush, I decided to use an unset ring. I crafted this with Essence of Delirium until I hit a T2 plus resist, and in my case I got very lucky, hitting +3 to level of socketed gems. From there, you can either toss your Malevolence in or your Determination, depending on if you need more damage or more defenses. I also side-gridded my Amulet to pick up some more intelligence and grab a few resists. In this case, it wasn't really that much of an upgrade, but it was also free. And by that I mean I bought my previous one for 1 divine. I then bought this one for 10, and sold the old one for 11.9. So I guess it wasn't actually free, I made 0.9 divines in profit. Remember, you don't need these exact stats, +1 fire skill, +1 all skill, fire dot multi, all of these work, combine them with life and res as you need. Then, I redid my shield twice to get +2 to maximum all resistances. In my case, I wanted Aspect of a Spider, but if you wanted something a little bit more defensive and maybe you were running Tempest Shield, then I could see going for +3 max Chaos Res instead. I bought a couple Fractured Shields, and ended up rolling them with a fossil combo that I outlined in my crafting video. I then went to work on the Crucible tree, replacing the 20% reduced global damage for -5% all Ellie res, picking up the same dex since I need it for my build, and 100% chance to avoid being shocked, meaning I enable the Storm Shroud without the need for an Abyss Jewel. And speaking of Storm Shroud, that's another change since my last update. I dropped Purity of Elements, swapping it for Skitterbots and Aspect of a Spider, bringing in quite a bit more damage and pushing my DPS up above 10 million. Though, to be honest, DPS isn't the most relevant thing for this build due to the high consistency of damage. I crafted the shield with fossil spam in a method that I outlined in my recent crafting video, so be sure to watch that after this if you're curious how I made it. Part of the reason I focused on the Crucible tree is Crucible trees offer a lot of power to this build. 80 dex frees up 1 passive and 1 suffix. 75 life is a pretty good gear prefix. Shock Avoid is 2 suffixes. 16% fire dot multi on my weapon, that's 1 less suffix, but also it's kind of not since it costs me a bit of resistance. And had I filled out even more on my Crucible tree, I'd have over a full item's worth of power. This is without any special crazy nodes. So as you're upgrading your gear, don't forget your Crucible trees both on weapon and shield. Now one thing I did retain from the previous version is I'm still using Oriath's End for clear. But I swapped in Taste of Hate for more Fizz mitigation. If you have a Progenesis, it's better to swap the Oriaths for this, especially when you're doing Uber bosses. But overall the build's quite min-maxed and capable of taking on all content PoE has to offer. Feared and Invitations were quite easy. Ubers were a bit more of a challenge. If I didn't pay attention, there were certain mechanics that could kill me. But it was still very doable due to great defenses and highly consistent damage. As a note, if you have a Progenesis lying around, you should absolutely swap it in if you're fighting Ubers. And as one last note, I also got a great Glorious Vanity. I think Ritual of Flesh and 2 Automaton studies are perfect, but 1 Ritual, 1 Automaton, and 3 total relevant notables is good enough, and I didn't feel like fishing through more seeds. Speaking of, all of my gear isn't perfect. My weapon could honestly be a lot better, and similarly, my ring could be upgraded quite easily as well. But it's good enough that I'm happy with it. I'm ready to move on to my next build because this one feels complete. Righteous Fire has been great. I remember playing the Inquisitor version during Arch Nemesis, and loving the fact that I could tank whatever rippy Arch-Nem combo I put together. Then the Jugg version in Crucible, well, Crucible wasn't all that rippy, because I was simply that tanky. Both builds are great, and I'd certainly recommend either one. Ultimately, I was going to say by the end of this video that I was recommending the Jugg over the Inquis, but now that I think about it, maybe I'd recommend the Inquis over the Jugg, or maybe they're just too close to tell and both are super awesome. With proper defenses and proper investment, you'll have more than enough damage for all content in the game. So I prefer to play builds that get those defenses easily, since I can always invest more to scale my damage. And on that note, yes, I did consider Aspect of Carnage. It would have been a huge damage boost, but my DPS felt fine, so ultimately I didn't want to tax my defenses anymore. The best thing about RF is you pop into a pack and it explodes. Unless you're really going out of your way to die, maybe doing a minus max, less life recovery map and clicking overwhelm minus res alters, you're going to be able to take quite a few hits and really not run into anything while mapping that feels super dangerous. Beyond all that, it's been an interesting journey. I started this early on kind of knowing what I was getting into, but also knowing that RF is really well covered. After all, if you have a question about it, Pox has probably answered it a couple 100 times over. And he's put a lot of those answers in his wiki, which I'll link to down below. But I've also never been the sort of person who plays another build because other people are, or doesn't play another build because other people are. I wanted something super tanky that felt great from early on, and I could scale it into the endgame. RF fit a build, so that's what I was playing. For this video series, I tried something a little bit different. I went over my thoughts for day 3 of a build, then some tips and tricks for anyone who might have been struggling. From there, I played days 4, 5, and 6, documenting the entire thing around day 7. Admittedly, because I'm slow and was doing too many things, it came out a few days later, but close enough. And let's be honest, a month from now, no one's going to remember if it was actually day 7 or day I think it was 10. Then I talked about how I was crafting the gear, added a couple of weird and fun mechanics which I found interesting, and here we are, the final showcase, at least for now, since I'm probably moving on from the build. I know this isn't quite the style that I've done in the past, but so far it seems to have done quite well, and hopefully everyone's enjoyed it. And I'm sure when the time comes, and I expect another league to be super rippy, I'll play it again. Early on, it was a little bit scuffed. Sure, I had a lot of armor, but chaos damage was absolutely deadly. Probably because I didn't cap my chaos res. I ran a few heists and mostly solved that problem. Then, as I moved towards my day 3 gear, it started to feel really good while mapping, but Crucible enemies could still kill me. And that was unacceptable. I needed more armor, better defenses, and most of all more life. Because that's the one downside of the Brass Dome version. You end up being a little bit short on life. However, as I continued to improve my gear, especially after I was pushing level 98 or 99 and could swap into a double cluster setup, I noticed everything just kind of clicked together. My damage was getting higher and higher even when I wasn't making major gear upgrades. I think this is in large part due to the double clusters and all the jewels you can run. I was able to pick up Storm Shroud, adding 2 offensive auras. And the Oriaths and Flask for Explodey Pops really made the build all come together. I actually kind of downgraded my gear from my previous video, because I had the Storm Shroud, but I didn't feel like it was really necessary, so I wanted to showcase a version that didn't have it, and then talk about it more in the upgraded min-maxed one, which, well, here you are. As one last tip, if you're doing a lot of farming and can afford to use a self-fight scarab on every map, I do suggest getting packed with energy. While you don't necessarily need it to clear, RF has plenty of damage and defenses and pretty good mobility between shield charge and frostblink, but 45% free move speed and 3% all max res, or at least all max LE, still feels really good. And so yes, RF as a build is great and I can absolutely recommend it. But what am I going to play next? I'm not really sure. The original plan was Poison Artillery Ballista, but that didn't quite work out. If you want to know more, I will link a stream, but I don't particularly advise the build, not because of the numbers. Yes, my setup was scuffed, but I could have fixed all that, because of a playstyle. It's not for me and might not be for you either. But if you enjoyed this RF journey and want to see a build series more like this, be sure to leave a like and let me know down in the comments below. Plus, if you are curious about that next build, get subscribed so you don't miss it. With that said, thanks for coming along with me, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. If you're looking for something else to watch, there's always the recommendation on screen right now, or you can check out my previous RF guide, some tips and tricks on how I crafted my gear, maybe that chest comparison, or the scuffed Poison Artillery Ballista that didn't really work out. Again, thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.